Gwatsi, Keshe. Greetings from the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center, and welcome to our counter-narrative. Our counter-narrative has been a presentation that we have been incorporating for a number of years now to help describe and talk about specific topics that it relates to us as Indigenous peoples. How we relate to land, how we relate to our cultures, and how we relate even to one another. And so that counter-narrative has always been a way that we present our story, how we present our narrative, and that's really what we want to help and how we develop this counter-narrative. Recently, there was a certain individual who felt that certain events that were occurring in this country, the civil unrest, the story by the New York Times that focused on the introduction of slavery here in the Americas to the U.S. colonies, to the American colonies. And so he felt that that was not the true story. And so by taking that challenge, saying that, yes, you're right, that's not the true story, that's not the full story, that's why these counter-narratives exist. So when we think about a large, multi-volumed or multi-chaptered novel, we don't start at chapter 13, or we don't start in the middle of the book. We try to start at the beginning. That's who we are as Indigenous peoples. We bring our part that was left out. So the counter-narrative is our way of saying, hey, you left out our part of the story, so we bring those stories to us. And in doing so, we've asked several Indigenous educators to participate and contribute to a story that helps us understand that. And so we're going to be talking about a number of topics today, but mostly it centers on taking ownership. And the title we choose is Pushback, not with force, but with knowledge, with wisdom, and certainly most importantly with education to take ownership of that. So first of all, we're going to begin with our introductions of our guests today. So if you wouldn't mind, Glenebah, please would you start?
Yes, hello too, and I'm good afternoon, everybody. My name is Glenebah Martinez, and I will be one of the panelists for today's presentation.
And Azella, go ahead, tell us who you are and where you're from.
Hi everyone, my name is Azella Humetewa, and I come from the Pueblos of Santo Domingo and Acoma.
And who's our next guest or a panelist?
I guess that would be me. Good evening, everybody. Gahate, Hopa, Taos, my name is Natalie Martinez, and I'm coming to you from the Pueblo of Laguna in the beautiful village of Guishti. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you, and we appreciate all that you are doing for our students and learning and contributing to what we want to help in accomplishing our efforts today. The counter-narrative, again, is a way to develop a dialogue. And for those of you who have tuned in, we would invite you to contribute a question or a comment. If you're on your screen there, you can raise your hand or go to the chat area, type in your question, we'll contribute that, and we'll let our guests contribute their knowledge and their expertise in that area. But to begin the discussion, what I'd like to have is, let's start off with Glenebah. And tell us, explain to us, or at least describe what we perceive, or what is the understanding of this patriotic curriculum memo that has been out there, or at least portrayed. And so if you want to tell us a little bit about that, Glenebah.
Well, actually I have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to do the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see you. And what I have here is I have a PowerPoint which kind of gives us some background knowledge on, or some ideas about how we came up with this particular panel. First of all, I like to kind of start off with just some ideas and talk a little bit about what counts as history, the politics of curriculum and content. There's basically 5 major ideas up there. First of all, history education is not neutral. It has never been neutral. It has always been embedded with biases and values. Number 2, ideology, values, and political agendas are embedded in official knowledge. And when I talk about official knowledge, when we talk about official knowledge, we're talking about that knowledge that is sanctioned either by the state, by some agency saying this is what counts as history. These are the standards. These are the assessments. These are the lesson plans. These are the textbooks. Marginalization and absence of the history of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous studies in official curriculum. We see this happening all of the time. We're either marginalized, in other words, we're mentioned every now and then, we're never at the center, or we're completely absent. And we're talking about in textbooks, resources, standards, syllabi, assessment, so on and so forth. A fourth topic under this is that the roles of sovereign native nations, stakeholders, and professional organizations in the conversation of curriculum and content were not always engaged. They never really call upon us to ask us about what we think about a particular assessment or curriculum. And then finally, the part that I'm going to talk a little bit about today is that we have to talk about the challenges, challenges of micro and macro, I would say racial aggressions to counter narratives in history. Okay, sorry. Okay. So when I think about this in terms of marginalization and so on and so forth. And so I look at it in 4 different instances, and we're not going to talk about all 4, but I just want to just share with you the way I'm seeing this, kind of the framework. So on the one hand, we have the Trump administration who sent out a memo on training in the federal government. I'm going to cover that a little bit on September 4th, 2020. We have the remarks by President Trump at the White House Conference in American History on September 17th. And on that same day, the establishment of the Commission on Patriotic Education in his remarks. At the state level, we can look at the aggressions by both the Martinez and the Grisham-Lujan administrations. We know that during the Martinez administration, when she was governor of New Mexico, was when the Yazzie Martinez case came to fruition, and they were engaged in the court case itself. And later on, during the Grisham-Lujan administration, after Judge Singleton, the late Judge Singleton, ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, Wilhelmina Yazzie and the Martinez plaintiffs, basically what happened was earlier this year, the state of New Mexico was requesting to dismiss the case or the ruling of the Yazzie Martinez case. And there will be some discussion about that in just a bit. At the city of Albuquerque level, when we talk about micro and macro aggressions, we can think about how public art and the Oñate Monument is another example of microaggressions or macroaggressions in terms of whose history is being portrayed here. And even in terms of the resolutions, how are resolutions made, or how are they resolving these conflicts? And of course, the older one, which was the road through the petroglyph. And then finally, Albuquerque Public Schools. That's an example of a microaggression in the school namings, like for example, Kit Carson Elementary School. Why do we continue to have an elementary school named after Kit Carson? And when they are trying to resolve this issue, why do they want to keep that discussion to the neighborhood that surrounds Kit Carson Elementary School rather than making it a large statewide discussion about racial healing, talking about truth and reconciliation and all the other issues attached to Kit Carson? And then finally, of course, the Cibola High School incident that took place on Halloween several years ago. So there was a memo that was sent out from the Trump administration. And here is an excerpt from that particular memo. And it starts off by saying, it has come to the president's attention that executive branch agencies have spent millions of taxpayer dollars to date training government workers to believe divisive anti-American propaganda. Employees have been required to attend trainings where they are told that virtually all white people contribute to racism, and that there is racism embedded in the belief that America is a land of opportunity. All agencies are directed to begin to identify all contracts or other agency spending related to any training on critical race theory, white privilege, or any other training or propaganda effort that teaches or suggests either 1, that the U.S. is an inherently racist or evil country, or 2, that any race or ethnicity is inherently racist or evil. The divisive, false, and demeaning propaganda of the critical race theory movement is contrary to all we stand for as Americans and should have no place in the federal government. So that was the first piece of evidence that we look at with the current administration. This was followed up by his remarks that he made at a convening at the archives, in which he talked a little bit, in which he talked about this idea of how schools were contributing to this downfall in our children. And he started off by saying that our mission is to defend the legacy of America's founding, the virtue of America's heroes, and the nobility of American character. We must clear away the twisted web of lies in our schools and classrooms and teach our children the magnificent truth about our country. We want our sons and daughters to know that they are the citizens of the most exceptional nation in the history of the world. Yet as we gather this afternoon, a radical movement is attempting to demolish this treasured and precious inheritance. Whether it is a mob on the streets or the cancel culture in the boardroom, the goal is the same: to silence dissent, to scare you out of speaking the truth, and to bully Americans into abandoning their values, their heritage, and their very way of life. And apparently there were testimonies that took place, and he goes on to say, as many of you testified today, the left-wing rioting and mayhem are the direct result of decades of left-wing indoctrination in our schools. It's gone on far too long. Our children are instructed from propaganda tracts like those of Howard Zinn that try to make students ashamed of their own history. The only path to national unity is through our shared identity as Americans. That is why it is so urgent that we finally restore patriotic education to our schools. I will soon sign an executive order establishing a national commission to promote patriotic education. It will be called the 1776 Commission. From Washington to Lincoln, from Jefferson to King, America has been home to some of the most incredible people who have ever lived. The legacy of 1776 will never be erased. Our heroes will never be forgotten. Our youth will be taught to love America with all their heart and all of their soul. And I was going to do an excerpt from here, but I think it would take too long, so I'm going to stop at this point here with the PowerPoint. But what I wanted to do with this is I wanted to establish kind of the macroaggressions that educators are dealing with, curriculum writers like us on this team from Indigenous Wisdom, and how our work is very similar to that of the 1619, if not more radical than the 1619 curriculum that was at the center of Trump's critique. And I'm really glad that all the writers are here, and I think tonight you're going to hear from them as practitioners, as researchers, as curriculum writers, and as Indigenous women about this whole response. What's our response to this? And we felt like this was our obligation to speak out to this as it affects us in New Mexico.
Well, thank you very much, Glenebah. To continue with our discussion, what I'd like to do is go to Azella. And if you wouldn't mind, Azella, the topic I'd like for you to present, or at least describe to us, is Glenebah mentioned about the Yazzie decision. If you wouldn't mind, describe to us or explain to us about the implications of Indian Ed here in New Mexico.
And so thank you so much for that, John. As a state that has an enormous amount of Native students in its school systems, it is critical for us to discuss the historical context of Indigenous education in not only the state, but across the country. And so I just want to give a brief historical context. And so pre-colonial education was really relied upon the community and the tribe, using elders and knowledge keepers in the villages that our students then came from. And then we moved into that whole movement of American Indian education, where it was the Americanization and the boarding schools, where the motto was to kill the Indian, save the man. From there, from that perspective, we then moved into self-determination by Native people, where we wanted to then reclaim Native education for ourselves. So then this brought into the fruition of many, many different tribal colleges and many, many schools of Indigenous philosophy trying to begin. And then we came to the realm of Indigenous education, where we are thinking about Indigenous philosophies and ideologies through community-based education and movements. And so when we think about Indigenous education, we think about, you know, I always go back and think about my schooling, coming up in a public school system where the curriculum that I was taught and the books that I read did not portray my history, my Pueblo's history, or even Native American history in great detail. It may have been a paragraph here, and we never as a class went through and really dissected and looked into what it really meant to be Indigenous, one, and to also just be proud of who we were as Indigenous people. And thus began my personal goal of becoming an educator, and then later being able to be a part of a school in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where the school was really, really community-led. The design of the school was community-led. And we wanted to establish a school that reflected the community's values and priorities, including holistic wellness, culturally relevant curriculum and design, language preservation, cultural relevancy, and identity and community relationships. And so we've created programs, academic programs, where we are thinking about creative and innovative ways to educate our children. And I believe that the implications for Indigenous education are very, very critical in this time. And so when we have an administration that's telling us that it's not important, you know, the counter narrative or the response is, yes, it is. Yes, it is critical that we are including our perspective and our histories into the curriculum that is being taught across America, because then we get that whole idea of hundreds and hundreds and thousands of children of learning that Columbus discovered America. And so we have to have that other perspective and the insight of Indigenous people, so that the historical content is accurate and is not just one-sided. Thank you.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you very much for that. Christine, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, ma'am.
you
I
unmute.
can hear you.
Okay, thank you, Christine. Well, first of all, to begin with, thank you for being one of our panelists. And before we begin, what I would like to ask you, if you wouldn't mind presenting a little bit about the Pueblo convocation. But before you do that, would you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you?
Just very briefly, thank you for inviting me. I'm from Acoma, Pueblo, and I work at the University of New Mexico. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Language, Literacy, and Social Cultural Studies in the College of Education. And I also direct the American Indian Language Policy Research and Teacher Training Center. And along with my colleagues that you see on this panel, we have all been involved as the lead team for the writing of the Indigenous Wisdom curriculum. So that's a little bit about my background. And then you wanted me to address or talk a little bit about the Pueblo convocation and its role in terms of, okay. So one of the things that I think bound us all together as a team was the fact that the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center played a key role back in 2012 in the creation of a special exhibition that talked about the impact of 100 years of state and federal policy upon Pueblo Indian nations. And that exhibit really was also the keystone, in a sense, for a convocation of all the 19 Pueblos that took place around that same time or shortly thereafter, in which Pueblo leaders identified for the Pueblo people who attended that meeting. They wanted to make sure that there was an acknowledgement of the importance of defining and identifying who we are as a Pueblo people, that our histories did not start at 1912, which was the centennial celebration of New Mexico's statehood, but that in fact our history as Pueblo people indigenous to this country, you know, started far back. And this whole idea of making sure people recognize that was also the impetus for their guidance and at their behest to create a curriculum that would not only reflect that history of ours to our own Native students, but as well, there was a purpose for making sure that this curriculum product that we were tasked with creating would be far reaching in terms of other students in the state, teachers perhaps who didn't know anything about our history. And there was already in that time a look towards the future, meaning what would be needed to make sure that, you know, kids in our state, you know this and have that content knowledge that is important to the history of New Mexico. So in a nutshell, that was where the convocation was really important in giving us guidance, because they identified what those core values are in terms of what has sustained us as Pueblo people. And the curriculum writing team that you see here today took those core values as the basis and foundation for writing the curriculum that we did, having the curriculum writers that joined us as the writing team, making sure that all of the curriculum units and lessons reflected those key Pueblo core values. And we've always been guided by that, because I believe, and I'm sure my colleagues join me in this as well, is that we have to be guided by the wisdom of our leaders. And that convocation was certainly a time when we all had to take a step back and retrospectively look at where we have come, where we are today, and where we will be going in the future. So this is a little bit about the Pueblo convocation. Thank you, John. I think you're mute, John.
Go forget a new technology. I'm learning too. Thank you very much for that, Christine. You know, you're all bringing up some very interesting concepts about education and how it applies to us as certainly as human beings, but more importantly as Pueblo peoples, and how we hold on to the stories of, and most importantly, taking ownership of those stories. And so certainly now we have sort of incorporated the legal system. And Glenebah brought this up a little earlier about the Martinez decision. Now we have, or we use that tool, the legal system of the United States to claim our right, and then going through the court saying that the court has to recognize us. And so to help explain that a little bit further, what I'd like to do is have Natalie tell us a little bit about the Yazi Martinez versus the state of New Mexico, how it applies to how we present culture and heritage of who we are as Pueblo people. Natalie. Great,
thanks, John. I'm really excited to be talking about this because I think it's really monumental in terms of the legislation that had been established already. I mean, previously in 2003, the New Mexico Indian Education Act was already on the books with our state legislature. And a great deal of my research has been focused on the implementation of that act. And, you know, even as far as the mid 2000s, a lot of people really had no clue about the New Mexico Indian Education Act, and that includes teachers who are teaching Indigenous children, that includes administrators, and so a lot of people really didn't have the background to know what the New Mexico Indian Education Act was about, and how to really implement it or to consider it in educational settings. So what Yazi Martinez, this monumental lawsuit did is it really brought the New Mexico Indian Education Act to the forefront. So just a bit of a background on this particular court case. In 2014, Wilhelmina Yazi, that Dr. Martinez, the other Dr. Martinez mentioned earlier, and her family were really questioning what kind of education and what kind of culturally responsive opportunities her children had. And at the same time, there was the Martinez family that was also questioning the same kinds of access and opportunities for their children and their families. And so they combined the lawsuits and it became a class action lawsuit, and has since become one of the largest class action lawsuits that has the largest range, the most implications, and really has impacted the state of New Mexico. And so now most educators know about Yazi Martinez, but they don't really know about Yazi Martinez. And so that's an important point to bring up, because a lot of people believe that Yazi Martinez is this big pile of money. And so a lot of people really are not being very critical about what the implications of the lawsuit have been, who's been involved in the lawsuit, and what our roles as educators are moving forward in regards to being able to meet the needs of the four target groups. So economically disadvantaged children, Native American children, English language learners, and students with disabilities. And so this class action really brought together families who are not being served by the Public Education Department of New Mexico, and worked to start to create a discussion about how best to meet the needs of these children. There were also several larger school districts that were involved, and several families. It did end up becoming more families than just the Yazis and the Martinezes. And as Glenebah had mentioned earlier, this year in 2020, the state had claimed that it met all of the stipulations of Judge Singleton's ruling, and we are very happy and blessed that Judge Matthew Wilson in June denied the state's appeal to say that they had already met all of the stipulations of the Yazi Martinez lawsuit. So the major findings: the state has failed to comply with state and federal laws. These are constitutionally guaranteed, and so the state failed to provide students with the programs and services that will prepare them for college and career. The funding that the state had always said was an issue, and it was an impediment in terms of being able to offer equal access and opportunities for all of these specific groups. It really is not an issue, and there was funding attached to the ruling as well, that the legislature needed to allocate the funding and to be able to share the funding with the school districts. And so I think really when we talk about originally the idea that we came up with based on our work together with the Indigenous Wisdom Curriculum, really is embedded in what we've done as critical educators, to be able to interrupt that master narrative, to provide the alternative, not as supplementary, but really as foundational in terms of the knowledge and the value of what Indigenous students have to offer, and Indigenous people in general, especially across the state of New Mexico, because we have had such a rich history. And as we're often reminded, we have survived as sovereign nations through 3 foreign governments at this point. And so the idea about how settler colonialism has really worked to try and shape the kind of education that is presented to our children in public schooling really has impacted the ways that that we perceive what counts as knowledge, as Dr. Glenebah has talked about oftentimes. And so it's important that understanding that there are multiple ways of knowing, and that there's not one history. We have histories, especially as Indigenous people, we have multiple histories, and those are all valuable and important pieces to who we are in interrogating and to counteract the process of assimilation and Americanization. And so, so it is not separate. However, it is part of the foundation of who we are as people who live on this continent. So thank you very much for allowing me to share that, and I look forward to our continued conversation.
That's a really just insightful way of presenting, and I love the word you used, was not supplemental, but rather foundational. That's hard to really, when people look at what Indigenous peoples say about their culture and their heritage, oftentimes they get accused of being revisionists, saying we want to change it, we want to start over again. But really, as you say, it's foundational. It's the core component of what we want to help our students, the rest of the general public understand about who we are as Pueblo, and certainly as Indigenous people. Before we go on, I'd like to know if there anybody listening to each of your presentations, would anybody like to kind of contribute to maybe what one of your other panelists said? Nope, nobody wants to say, okay, or add. I'm glad you all had something to say about that. Go ahead. Go ahead, Natalie.
I do, because Dr. Sims talked at some length about the role of the Indigenous wisdom curriculum, and really the role of the counter narrative. And so as we start to engage in what that means and what it looks like, we provide a lot of training for public schools, for educators across the state of New Mexico. And so there is this belief, a lot of teachers believe that they can't use the Indigenous wisdom curriculum because they are not Native American. In reality, it's so important that all children are able to learn about the backgrounds and the important events and figures and ways of thinking and ways of knowing that Indigenous Pueblo people have contributed to the history of our state. And so so I think that that's a really big takeaway for what we're trying to share with you all this evening as well.
Unmute yourself, John.
Again, thank you very much for that, Natalie. I want to ask a question for each of you to respond to, if you wouldn't mind, perhaps maybe a 3 to 4 minute response, kind of reflecting upon my question here. Is certainly we can look at, education is not, anything new. All civilizations have learned to teach those who preceded them in many ways, and to learn how to plant, how to live off the land, how to create their societies, how to speak the languages. So language, knowledge and education are really just a human endeavor. But now we're talking about the different tools that we have and the different constructs that we have as it applies to education. So my question to each of you, if you wouldn't mind, is why is it important that we provide this kind of education to our Native students? Go ahead, anyone.
I'll start, and maybe we'll just keep on adding to the chain. Well, one obvious reason is because our students in our history, their histories, as Natalie has rightly said, are not reflected in the curriculums that we have had in our schools. And I've had a lot of folks, in fact, I know Azella has said, numerous times, she didn't learn, and I'll have to probably say it's the same case with me. I didn't learn anything about my own history in schools. I didn't even come across that till I went to college, and some of us, that's been our experience. And so when you think cumulatively of what that blackout of one's history means in terms of how you reflect on your own identity, but also your place in society and in your own world, your own cultural community, that's a lot of messaging that we send through curriculums that tell us whether we're important or not, or whether, you know, society chooses to ignore us or not. And I think that's one of the biggest things outrightly that we see when we don't have those things in front of us and in front of our students. Maybe
I'd
somebody
like to piggyback on Chris's statement, and thinking about how important it is for those mirrors in curriculum, for students to be able to take a look at what they're studying and who they're studying about, and to see themselves and envision themselves in the future. Because, you know, as Indigenous people, we have duties and obligations as we come into adulthood to our home communities, and to really be able to start to develop some ideas for, you know, for possibilities about what we could do to contribute to our home communities. And I think that's always important for students to be able to see themselves reflected. So I'll hand it off to someone else. I just wanted to chime in on Chris's comment there.
And I just wanted to add that, you know, at our school, we see students not just as academic piece, but there's a whole holistic wellness philosophy for each student that attends our school. This honors their whole self, you know, their social emotional learning, their personal wellness, their physical wellness, all of those things help make up their students. So if they're not doing well socially and emotionally, they probably won't be doing well academically. And so it's critical for us as educators and as schools to really, really understand that our students come to school with many, many different challenges, but they're also very resilient. And we, so many times in our historical context, we always have, you know, heard the stories of our histories of being, you know, dark and yeah, very, very dark. And so when we can then turn that around and say, yes, our history has been dark. However, we are a resilient people. We are the next generation, and we are the ones that are going to continue the legacy of our ancestors. And so when, as an educator, I've always tried to instill that in my students, that we have heroes in our own communities. And so we don't necessarily have to study a hero from, you know, Greece or from, you know, from another continent. We have heroes in our own communities. And so it's really, really important for our students to see themselves in the heroes, in the teachers, in the educators that they're learning from. And so I believe that it's very, very wonderful that when we talk about Indigenous education and the movement, it is very, very exciting to see that, you know, we have students who've gone through our school, then go to college, but then come back and want to be educators themselves and want to continue that legacy. And so I believe that, you know, we're doing really, really great things when it comes to Indigenous education. And I think that we definitely, there's a lot more to do. And so it's very, very important for us to stay the course and to, you know, use these moments such as this counter narrative opportunity to then help us really think critically about what we're teaching in our classrooms and what we're doing in our schools to help the next generation move up. Thank you.
Thanks, Al. And I'm really glad you talked about NACA, because I think there's a great deal of information we can get, wisdom from what's going on there, as well as many other schools that serve Indigenous youth. But more importantly, our own things that John talked about at the beginning, which is our Indigenous-centered ways of educating our youth, which is not in classrooms, it's not in English, and it's not in a school. It's what happens in our traditional ways of living, that traditional education that we don't talk about. And so, because it's sacred information, it's private information. But I just wanted to just answer your question that I was thinking about 3 studies I conducted. One study was on Indigenous youth in an urban public high school. Then I did another one on students who attend a border town high school. I was looking at Taos because I had been asked by the Taos school board, the Pueblo school board, to talk about why the kids didn't want to go to school in town anymore. And then the third one was a study that I did with Native youth who came to UNM. They were freshmen and sophomores, reflecting back on what they learned in their history classes and how they were navigating what they're learning now at UNM, or then. They were freshmen and sophomores then. And I would say that while there were certainly 3 different sets of results from those 3 different studies, I would say one of the common themes that comes from that is the importance of making a representation of Indigenous peoples in textbooks and in resources, but also the idea of respecting the integrity of sovereignty. Many of them talked about how we don't want to just be the same people, Pocahontas, Squanto, the usual themes that emerge in textbooks, like New Mexico history textbooks. They wanted to talk about, let's talk about the nitty-gritty elements of Indigenous history. Let's talk about slavery. Let's talk about the encomienda systems. Let's talk about the repartimiento systems. Let's talk about the long walk. Let's talk about all these things. And they said, it can't be a pretty story. And I recall one student I was interviewing for the urban study I did on urban Native youth. She was really frustrated. She said, today, she said, we spent the whole day just talking about the Holocaust, and we had to read excerpts from the diary of Anne Frank and I think some other things from the Shoah. They were looking at some other documents. And she says, it's really disturbing. She says, because we suffered a Holocaust in the United States. We suffered a Holocaust in the Americas, and it still goes on today. If you go look at Central America and you look at South America with the demise of Indigenous peoples because of all the land grabbing, and she said, they never talk about our Holocaust. And then she talked about how she was disturbed by the fact that Holocaust went from being a noun to a proper noun, and then was now used in reference to one particular historical period. And so our students, and she was a junior. And so, I know that there is that frustration by youth, at least in my studies. And when I work with Native youth who are incarcerated at YDDC and Camino Nuevo, the same thing was said there. They were saying, we're really tired of being presented in these really either essentialized representations, or we're tired of we learn about other peoples, but we never learn about what happened in New Mexico. And so, I think there's a lot to be said about what happens when students see themselves, not only just see themselves in the curriculum, but see themselves in meaningful ways. And so the IPCC curriculum, what's called now the Indigenous Wisdom Curriculum, one of the guidelines, or one of the essential, one of the guiding principles is about how we need to honor that integrity. We need to honor that the fact that we are sovereign people. We are not just any minority group. We have sovereign status, that meaning that this is our land, this is our nation. We are citizens of another nation. And for some reason, that is really hard for people to conceptualize. And it's ridiculed, it's marginalized, it's essentialized, it's exotified, it's objectified. I can give you all kinds of processes, but that's what happens. And so back to this patriotic education, what Trump is trying to do, he really can't do anything, okay? Because that's a national, and states control the education. But the fact that he's getting people to think about what constitutes history education is very scary because there are people who listen to him, and he instills fear into that. He says, if we don't teach a patriotic education, this is going to happen. And that has been a redundant theme of his, instilling fear into people.
Thanks, Glennie. I wanted to support your statements there, because, you know, when we think about the ways that Indigenous people are presented in curriculum as well, a lot of times we're relegated to the past. We're not shown in modernity. Our contemporary lives and our contemporary careers and educations and continuance of our life ways really are not, those aren't portrayed. And I think that's important for students to be able to see and to understand, because we're living it. This is our lived reality. And, you know, as we talk back to this idea about, you know, having a patriotic curriculum, it really is, you know, that's what we have now. Right. And so that's what the counter narrative is intended to do, is to really provide that pushback, you know, hence the name of our talk tonight, because that is really what we have. We have a standard master narrative that that really needs to be interrogated and needs to be updated in lots of different ways. That's things.
I guess
I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to just respond to something real quick. But before we do, if you wouldn't mind, Azella, just briefly tell us about, you said NACA, and maybe some people don't know about NACA. Just briefly tell us about NACA.
Sure. So NACA stands for the Native American Community Academy. It is a public charter school in Albuquerque, New Mexico that was started in 2006. And so we're celebrating our 15th year this year. And the school was really started as I said before, it was a community-led process where many different people from the community, parents, students, community members, community leaders, tribal leaders, all were wanting a school where you know, Indigenous perspective was one of the catapults of you know, rising the Indigenous education piece. And so in the Albuquerque, New Mexico, I don't know how many, there are over 100 different tribes in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So this was a need and a want of the community to start a school where we are represented and where we can create opportunities for students to then, all of these things that we're talking about this evening, you know, where we can create curriculum and where we can create opportunities for students to see themselves and to learn about, you know, all of the different Indigenous heroes and concepts that may not be taught in public schools.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. We still have a little bit of time, but I want to make sure that we get one more last thing that Glenebah brought up. And we're all Pueblo members. We're all educators. And it seems like we're focusing on that Pueblo construct. However, as Glenebah brought up about Squanto and Pocahontas, and not to minimalize our other Indigenous communities throughout what we now call the United States, they all have a story. And their stories are just as relevant and just as important. So briefly, if you wouldn't mind, each of you, perhaps tell our audience out there why it's important to ensure that our stories are just as relevant to whatever community, whatever tribe, whatever Indigenous nation they belong to, why they should work toward making that part. And this goes along with somebody's question that came up from one of our viewers. What kind of legislation should be best used to incorporate history a little more accurately? So each of you briefly, about 2 or 3 minutes, so we have enough time for everybody.
Well, John, I just wanted to tail off of what my colleagues have just said, but maybe this segues into your question too. But what I think are the implications, and I think this is why we titled our presentation tonight as the pushback. There's some real deep implications, not only for just Native or Indigenous peoples, but all peoples who have a different history other than what folks like Trump and people who follow his way of thinking would want people to think is just the narrative, the one narrative. And the implications, I think, for that is not a huge step, especially for people who are easily swayed by that kind of talk. It's not a far step to imagine that people will start equating that one narrative with being American. And doesn't that sound exactly like things happened, 100 or 50 years ago, with the kind of education that was imposed upon Indigenous peoples? Either you were American or not. You either became, part of that. David Wallace Adams, talks about that whole underpinning of education, and it sets up this false dichotomy of whether you're American or not. And it's not a huge step to imagine that people would start thinking like that. Either you accept that one narrative, and anything else is counter to that, so you must not be patriotic, i.e. you must not be American. And that's the danger, I think, of seeing this kind of narrative put out in the public, knowing that there are people that essentialize these things down to just one or two things. And I think that's very dangerous, and that's why we need to keep pushing back, because we know that that isn't true and it's not right. And we also need to help our students become critical consumers, of what they read, what they study, so that they also are not swayed by that kind of talk and narrative. And so I just wanted to mention that because that came to mind as we were talking about some of these things.
All right. It's really important for me, especially as an educator of young people and as an educator of future educators, to really be able to help students, adult students who are going to be teaching our young people, to understand the importance, the contemporary realities, and the fact that there is more than one history. There are multiple ways that Indigenous people have contributed to what we live today as, what we know as America right now. And it's important because when I think about my children and my grandchildren, I know that I have Janelle and Christina on the call here, and I think about my 4 beautiful granddaughters. What is it that I want them to be able to experience in school? And it's such a crucial time right now to act, to be able to make that difference for all children in schools, so that we can learn in a more balanced and equitable way. So those are the important factors for me as well.
That's a good point, Natalie. And, I was looking at some archival evidence, some letters from Carlisle Indian School. And I was reading some letters that, I forget the guy's name. Anyway, Yellow Robe was one of them, and there was wounded something. Anyway, and what's interesting is that while they recognize that there was definitely a assimilative, Americanizing type of agenda to going to Carlisle Indian School at its first opening into the early 20th century. They also recognize the fact that it was important that the students, or that the youth, recognize that there's 2 bodies of knowledge, and that these 2 bodies of knowledge were going to be critical in dealing with this foreign intervention from the U.S. They recognize the U.S. as a colonizing intervention, and that you had to be able to understand what they were doing. So it almost harkens back to the idea of being able to be in the belly of the beast, to be able to understand how to articulate and navigate and try to transform something. But that's really tricky, because the reality of kids when they're in school is that teenagers are at that age in their development where they want to be part of communities. You know, they want to be part of teams. They want to be accepted. They're grappling with their own identities, whether it's gendered identities or racial identities or social identities, cultural identities, religious identities. That's just a really difficult time, I think, for them. And sometimes if they don't have that support from their family, or there isn't this constant knowledge or this constant loving way of teaching who they are, then sometimes what happens is that they then begin to question their own existence as what does it mean to be a Native person. And it doesn't help when schools do not do anything to help that. And so this new movement, well, it's not a new movement, but it's called socio-emotional learning, like Project Echo. I know that Professor Sims has been part of that community. Project Echo has been talking about socio-emotional learning as being part of that we have that responsibility as educators to also talk about the hearts and the minds of our students. They're just not these people who come to be, to pour in using the banking method of putting in knowledge, but they're thinking and feeling people. And now especially is really critical. I know I'm concerned about this coming election on Tuesday. If I have graduate students who are in my classes and they're concerned about social media. They've taken it on themselves to look at social media. And there are a lot of youth who are really either going to the far right and saying they will take up arms if Trump doesn't get elected, okay, to some people who are really afraid to get out the next day because they don't know what's going to happen if there's going to be race riots. And that's what I'm saying is that this whole campaign and this whole thing of instilling fear, it's taken over. And as adults, we can deal with it, can say, oh, what's your issue? But if you're 16 years old, 14 years old, it's scary. It's a scary place. It's a scary time. And now adding to that is COVID, in which our youth now have created cyber communities because they can't run cross country together. They're not together in these physical face-to-face ways that they've always been adjusted to. Now they're at home all the time, which is good. But at the same time, as you know, when you're a teenager, it's hard.
Azalea?
So I just wanted to touch a little bit on, at NACA, we really talk about land-based learning as well. And so creating meaningful opportunities for our kids to experience experiences so that our students can create those connections with the natural world. As you know, Pueblo people, we are ingrained in, we come from the natural world, the trees, the mountains, the land around us. And so it's really important for our students to see themselves and their historical context within a land-based space as well. And so when we think about, all of the things that are happening right now in the world, this whole COVID pandemic, and bringing students inside and they're on a computer screen all day and they're having to sit through a Zoom meeting after a Zoom meeting. It's really important for us to really, and I know that my colleagues touched upon the social emotional piece of it. It's really critical for us to encourage our kids to, get out into the land and really be able to experience just being outside. And I know it's difficult because, we have to social distance and we have to wear the masks, but it's very interesting to see some of our students, the way that they're dealing with this whole COVID pandemic and being, stuck in their room all day long. And then for them to be able to go outside and their experiences around that, I feel that, that's one of the components that is really important to our kids at this time. And I want to echo what Dr. Martinez is saying about, the fear about, what's going to happen on Tuesday. And a lot of our students right now are really nervous and scared. And as teachers and as educators, we're really having those discussions around, one, acknowledging the fear, but also being able to try to calm those fears. And it's been an ongoing piece that we've been working with in our schools. And so, thank you.
Sure. Well, the time goes by so fast, and it sounds like from some of the small chats and the questions we're getting that a lot of people are gaining a lot from the knowledge and the wisdom that you all contribute. So really, it's my honor to be in a discussion with you ladies. And so as we get ready to close here, I just want to thank you all, Dr. Glenebah Martinez, Dr. Natalie Martinez, Dr. Christine Sims, and Azella Humetewa, that you are providing knowledge for those who are your students. And it brings me to mind the fact that here at the Cultural Center, this is a place where many of our ancestors were students taken away from their families. They paved the way for us to be here. Without their experience, without the trauma they endured, without the resilience of being taken from their homes, we would not have the credentials, the professional skills, and the wisdom to say to students in the future that this is the narrative, this is the stories that we want to make sure that we will continue to tell. And so we're taking that challenge of that patriotic narrative, that we assume it, we own it, and push back and say, this is our story, you just left it out, this is we want to contribute to it. So thank you, ladies. Thank you very much for this wonderful discussion. And anyone out there, if you want to have further discussions, go to the Indian Pueblo Cultural website at indianpueblo.org. There are opportunities to ask questions, for perhaps contact information from our panelists today. There's other information from the Indigenous Wisdom Curriculum that's on our website. Also, there's a number of opportunities for learning, for book readings, for book clubs, and many other opportunities. So again, thank you very much, ladies. My best to you all. Take care, be safe, wear your masks, please, and we will see one another again, and we'll invite everybody to our feast days, okay? Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Alakwa.
Thank
Inakama.
Thank you, ladies. Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Do you need us anymore, or are we done?
We're done.
Oh, okay.
Okay, are you gonna save the chat and the questions?
So.
Yes, we should be able to save everything.
Okay.
And also this is recorded and we'll be sharing
Yeah.
that through Facebook and social media and on our website as well eventually once we edit.
I only answered one of the questions in the question and answer thing real quick, but there was another one that I didn't get to, so I just want to make sure you guys got that question.
Go vote. Go vote.
Already did.
Yeah.
Okay, see you guys. Thank
Bye-bye,
you, Rachel.
everybody.